Hello everyone. This is the video recording that I told you I would do to help you out with the school finance template. From a bigger picture standpoint, the reason we're doing this is to understand at the detail level how Texas is embedding equity and adequacy in the system in order to meet the constitutional requirement of an efficient and suitable system for the general diffusion of knowledge. And as we know, at this point in time, the court has ruled that this system is unconstitutional because it does not meet the suitable or efficient requirement, and much that we will discuss later. The first driver of the system is still, and has been for years, student attendance. And the figure that we're trying to calculate to start the whole process is what's called the refined ADA, which is really just an average of all the days students were in attendance for the entire school year. And in order to make this simple, I've changed up this template a little bit because what we're going to end up doing is just having to put some fictitious ideas of what that attendance was, the percentage was of that particular semester. And our system tells us this is how we get the number. The first number we have to come up to with, though, is what is the enrollment for the district, not the ADA, but the enrollment. Well, I happen to already know the district I'm going to use is Abilene ISD, and I already know it's for 2012 it was 1,705.61, something like that. So that's our starter number. So you'll notice as this populates. Well, the reason for that is because we're taking this number times the number of days for the 6 weeks. That gives us the total possible number of days students could have attended school for each 6 weeks. And of course, we know we're going to have absences throughout the year. We're going to have a different rate for each. So we're going to put in some, this is where I made a change. We're going to put in some just fictitious numbers. So for example, first 6 weeks, probably pretty good attendance. Probably going to drop down a little bit. Let's say it's 96.5. Maybe 95 for that one. And then we hit a bad flu season. Let's say it was 94. And we're back up here at around 96. Then we finish up really strong, 98. Okay? And you're going to see a new number here, average. So you're going to take this average of all of this, which comes out to 96%, times the total enrollment, and you're going to get a number that's refined ADA. Well, then that moves us to our first stage of the process, which is moving to Tier 1. Now, in brief review, what Tier 1 is this is that fundamental amount, that basic amount that in theory should be enough to provide the services that should be provided for all students. When we get to Tier 2, this is the funding that, in theory, districts have meaningful discretion to tap into in order to enrich the basic program. So that's the way they're differentiated, because in the Constitution, there's two parts to it. First, of course, is the legislature's requirement to provide for a general diffusion of knowledge through an efficient and suitable system. However, there's a second portion that says you can't do this with a state property tax, which means that each district must have some meaningful discretion to manipulate their tax rate. Otherwise, it is by default a state property tax, or at least by the court's decision. Well, the second number we need is we need to see what is the adjusted allotment. This is a number that kind of gives you what's the base number that this district has to start with before we start playing around with allotments and things like that. So the way to find that out is we're going to go over here to the TEA website, and if you get a chance, do something on your screen. Do a where you can put both of these together so you can see what's going on. So we're going to go here to the TEA website. I'm going to A to Z index, and I'm going to go to F because I want finance. I want to look at school district finance, and then I'm going to look at the district summary of finances. That will come up in just a moment, hopefully. Then I'm going to select the summary of finances report. I want the 12-13 school year because we're going to get our most recent data. And as I said, I'm going to use Abilene as an example. And you'll notice after the few letters, Abilene comes up. I'm going to submit. And then it's going to ask me which report that I'd like to see. I'm going to go all the way bottom to the latest report, and I want the HTML report because I want to be able to do some of the interactive things inside there. And notice this says near final. That means we're getting very close to closing out the year. So I'm going to go to the HTML version. And right around the top of the version, we should be able to see that first number we're looking for. And that first number we're looking for over here is what is the adjusted allotment? Well, we see the average daily attendance. So again, we used our own figures over here, so you don't need to pay any attention to whether it's different from that. In fact, for the whole thing, if it's a little different, that's okay. We're going to scroll down and see if we can find our adjustment allotment. And there it is, about 3 columns down under funding components. And then it'll show you actually how that adjustment allotment is created. But we're not going to worry about how that was created. We're just going to use that number. So 5069, that number goes in there. So that's our first starter number. That number times the refined ADA gives us a base amount of funding here. So we know where we're getting started right here. We got at least $85 million to start with. Well, let's go to special education. Now is that part where we're going to put in some program data that is given to us by our system based on what's put into the system. We're going to go over to the special ed worksheet, and you'll notice that there are several instructional settings that pertain to special education, and they all have different weightings. And the way to determine how much funding we get with this is to multiply the weighting, which is going to multiply against our adjusted allotment, times the full-time equivalents we have students involved in that. And remember, full-time equivalents is not individual students. It's a calculated amount of time students are involved in that particular setting. So let's start with homebound. Well, where do we find this information? Well, let's go back over to our summary of finance, and you should find somewhere where it talks about the special ed detail report. So we're going to pull that up and look, and I would bet we're going to see, as soon as it comes up. And by the way, we're using the last column. You'll see an LPE, I think a DPE and LPED. We're using the near final column over here. That's what we're interested in. So homebound, according to the near final, don't pay any attention to that end of the year services full-time equivalent. Right here, near final payment FTE. So we've got 0.602. So we're going to put that in there. And then we're going to go right on down the line. I happen to know everything matches up because I designed it that way. On hospital class, 5.491. And on down the line, and I could keep going on all this. So again, I'm not going to fill the whole thing out for you. I'm just going to say you can keep going on all this. And you'll notice back over here, under the special ed allotment, numbers are starting to add up. I'm sorry, let me get back over here to Tier 1. We're starting to get a number. So by the time we're done here, didn't want to do that. By the time we're done, we're going to have a lot of money right here for special education. Then we're going to go directly to the summary of finance, and instead of trying to calculate that to make this simple, we're going to go back over here and look and say, okay, where is the career and technology funding? So by the way, anyway, I'm going to kill out of that, get back over here, and find the area where it puts in, where it shows us the allotments for that. So, for example, career and technology, right here, career and technology, 4,176,000. I'll just put that number in here to show you. 4,176,897. And you will continue on with that with the data from the summary of finance. They'll have a transportation allotment in there, a high school allotment. In this case, Abilene evidently did not open a campus, so you've got a new instructional facilities allotment. And you're going to end up with a total Tier 1 entitlement here. Now you'll notice it's going to say state share at this point is 100% and the local share is 0. Well, we know that's not the case. It's a shared responsibility between the state and the local community for the school districts. So we have a piece of data to put in. So over here in the LFA, local fund assignment, we have to put in a piece of data. And as we know, the number one in driver of the process for wealth equalization is the property value estimate or the property values that exist in the district. So let's find in the summary of finance where we can see that. Should be, I'm missing it somewhere. Actually, here we go. Not M&O. Here we go. Property values. Uh, we're going to use current year, which in this case is 3 billion. I'm sorry, 837,179,358. And you'll notice this tells us locally at the what's called the compressed tax rate, which is a dollar, which is represented as 0.01 times that. At the compressed tax rate, this should be the local community's responsibility for the basic amount of education. And we go back to Tier 1, you'll see how that impacts who shares what percentage of that. In this case, uh, the state is going to share 58% of this 90 million, and the local government is going to share 30 or 42% or 38 million of this local amount. This amount doesn't change, just how much is paid by the local community and the state is what changes as a variable. And remember one of the things I showed you, what if, for example, this number was $10 billion more? If I put a 1 on there, and I go back and look at this Tier 1, you see a whole new change here. This number hasn't changed. However, we've got a lot more revenue here, but the state is not going to let you keep that. In fact, 47 million of this is going to be recaptured and redistributed through some method that we'll talk about later regarding Chapter 41. But it's going to be recaptured back to and reallocated back to the system. And this is an example of that. Well, in this case, we know that's not the case in Abilene. Their property values are not that high, and actually it would make sense if you think about it. If you've got that many universities, I believe you got Abilene Christian, you got McMurray, and I think there are others there, and that's all tax-exempt land, you're probably going to have somewhat of a difficulty generating a great deal of property value. So that essentially would finish Tier 1 once you've got all of that information. Then you go to Tier 2. Now, in order to establish Tier 2, we have to have calculated something called a WADA. And a WADA is a weighted average daily attendance, which is kind of strange from a standpoint when you look at the formula for it. Not a great deal has anything to do with ADA, but it is referred to that as weighted. It's embedded in the system, but in the direct formula you don't see as much of it. So we got the basic allotment, and you see that from we learned this from the School Finance 101 worksheet. Everybody starts with 4765, or most everyone. Now, there are cases where they don't, but for the most part, that's the starting point. If you go back over here, you're going to find also everybody has an adjustment that's called the cost of education index. And it's usually up here fairly close. Cost of education, here we go. 1.09 is the cost of education index. Well, what is that anyway? Well, in theory, this represents the amount of funding that it essentially may cost more to do business in a particular area. So in theory, the cost of education index is an adjustment factor that is related to your geographic area, your cost of labor, all kinds of factors. You will hear at each legislative session that this is a continual argument that this needs to be updated. The urban districts would argue it's substantially more expensive to educate children in urban areas, and the rural districts would say, hey, wait a minute, it's because you've driven salaries up so high that we all have to do this. So there's probably some validity to the arguments there. But the thing you should notice is the difference between, the difference between this number, 18,226, and that initial refined ADA number of 16,000. A weighted ADA represents really your average daily, really your refined ADA plus your students that you include all your program allotments and all the things that go in there, your special education children, so it gives you a weighting. So that's kind of a starting figure to go into the next phase, because we're in phase 2 now, or tier 2. We've already done tier 1, so this is how much you get for your basic education. Now we're going to tier 2. Here's how much the state may enrich your funding that you choose to go beyond the dollar tax rate. And that is tier 2. This is where we're in the area of meaningful discretion. Now, all of this is filled out for you, so I'm just going to kind of explain how it arrived this way. We're going to start with the compressed tax rate, which for most everyone is $1, although there are some exceptions. But for our purposes, we're going to assume that. We're also going to assume in this case that the district has pursued their discretionary pennies outside of the dollar, which by law is capped at 17 cents. Now, those 17 cents generate different levels of funding. For example, the golden pennies are set to a point where essentially there could be there should be no recapture from golden pennies. In theory, although there's probably some exceptions, anybody that is choosing to use those first 6 cents is getting the full value of their property values and possibly some state funding. So that was kind of the idea that all districts could pursue that first 6 cents regardless of their wealth. This is why you might see, for example, the total a TRE for a property wealthy district might be 2 cents instead of them going for an additional 13 cents. And the reason is because they won't get recaptured on these first pennies, but they're going to get substantially recaptured on the additional pennies above 6 cents. As a side conversation, as far as the approval of these rates, you may recall that boards can only approve the first 4 after the dollar, but voter approval must occur for anything after that. This has to do with anything after that and how it's funded. The idea of the tier 2 is the fact that the state is actually going to enrich the pennies that you put into the system, and we call that enrichment the guaranteed yield. As you can see, they're going to the state is actually going to pay $60 per weighted ADA, and we call these the golden pennies. They're going to pay $31, almost half of that, for the remaining 11 cents, and we call those the copper pennies. And since this is such a lower amount of yield from the state, the chances of recapture are much higher. Now, there's always going to be a state and local combination of this. I can show you, for example, or I will in a second, if we did that same thing and we changed the amount of property value, which is driving this whole thing, we will see different percentages. So let's do that real quick. If I went to LFA again and we added $10 billion, and then we go back and look at tier 2, you're going to see huge differences here. So for example, in this case, this district is so wealthy, they're going to experience a small amount of recapture even on golden pennies. Now, in reality, that probably wouldn't happen because the standard has been set already. So I've probably gone out there so far on property values that no situation exists like that. But you can say there's no way they'd want to go for these pennies right here because they would have to actually reallocate millions of dollars back to the state instead of being able to put that in their own local community. So I'm going to go back and change this back to what it's supposed to be. So that gives us a tier 2 amount of money, 12,859,000, and I'm going to go all the way back, and then back to tier 1, and you see we've got 90 million here, and then when you look here, 12. Now again, you're going to have more than that because you haven't put all the data in yet. But when you do, you're going to finish up with a total amount of state funding that would include everything from tier 1, which again, you got a lot more data to put in here, all the way across, and you'd have a new figure across here showing here's what you should get in state and local funding. This is just a really simple kind of basic approach to this. Again, do not consider this as any kind of accurate measure of what your revenue would be. It just philosophically covers that. So hopefully this will help. And we'll talk more about it in class. I can do WebExes with you in between to help you out. So have a good few weeks before we meet again.